uh, that some of the text here does include folks from Dan, and that the text was somehow uh, corrupted at some point. I frankly don't believe that last part. I really do believe that for whatever reason, um, Ezra didn't see a need to include the tribes of Dan and Zebulun in the listing. Um, we see here in we see this listing of the numbers. You see in verse 2, for example. Uh, Here is the sons of Issachar and the descendants of Issachar, and their number in the days of David was 22,600. In verse 4, here is 36,000 troops of the army for war. Again, assumingly in the days of David. Their relatives among all the families of Issachar were mighty men of valor, enrolled by genealogy, all of them 87,000. And he goes on in a number of these passages as he lists out these family lines and groups. He'll give the numbers of the men, of the fighting men. Um, why provide that? What's the point of that information? We find that these figures here are generally consistent with what we find in the book of Numbers. That Numbers should have been capitalized because that's the book name, the book of Numbers. And so we find that these counts of the fighting men were generally consistent. And some thought is that perhaps the writer, Ezra, is trying to remind the Jews of the might of their nation as it had been at its peak in the days of David. If you remember, if you read the account of Ezra, and you see the number of Israelites that came back out of captivity, it was a small fraction of the numbers that are listed here. Um, if I remember correctly, I think the number listed in Ezra was between 50 and 60,000 that came back out of Babylonian captivity, and yet here we see numbers in the perhaps hundreds of thousands of fighting men who would have been part of that army at the time of David, certainly, and it is a reminder to them of the greatness of their nation, to remind them of where they had been and where they perhaps could be again. Um, there's almost no commentary in chapter 7. It's almost all genealogy, with one or two exceptions. And this is in verses 21 to 23. And I would have to look at this: the descendants of Ephraim. It says the sons of Ephraim were Shethuiel and Bered his son, Tahath his son, Eliadad his son, Tahath his son, Zabad his son, and of course comes through, and whom the men of Gath, who were born in the land, were killed because they came down to take their livestock. We see this story recounted for us in the book of Genesis, in Genesis 37. If you turn with me over to Genesis 37, in verse 34. I'll have to look it up. This does parallel an account that we find in Genesis of the death of Ephraim's sons. And we see what happens. That he lost his sons because the men of Gath killed them because they were taking cattle. They were having fights over who owned the cattle. But we notice that this is kind of interesting in verse 23. Then he has a son named Beriah, and this Beriah is son of misfortune. But we see it's more interesting is what's going on in verse 24. His daughter was Shira, who built the lower and upper Beth Horon, and also Uzan Shira. So here is a woman name. This was fairly unusual. Here's a woman name. You know, we talk about female empowerment in our day. Well, this was an empowered female in the days of these descendants of Ephraim. This woman was building cities. She built the city of Beth Horon, and she also built one called Uzan Shira, which is named after herself. Her name is Shira, and this Uzan Shira, that the name of that city literally means "listen to Shira," and so she must have been a woman of considerable strength of character and of considerable influence to have accomplished this. And so it kind of why would Ezra mention this? Why would Ezra bring this out? And I think the reason is that he brings this out is, again, he's going to show how the rebuilding of the nation is going to require everybody. It's going to require everybody's coordination, everybody's cooperation, everybody's involvement. And so here he names a woman from their history who, and we find her mentioned actually nowhere else in the Old Testament. And yet here she is mentioned in the book of Chronicles as building cities. Obviously, again, so a woman of some influence, able to accomplish this goal of building up the nation, of helping to build up the nation. Any questions or comments on that? From there, then, we go into the chapter 8. And here in chapter 8, now we're going to see this genealogy of Benjamin. This genealogy is focused on Benjamin up to King Saul, and then continues with Jonathan's line to again establish the beginnings of the kingdom in Israel. Some scholars will look at this genealogy in chapter 8, and they'll try to reconcile it with the genealogy for Benjamin that's given over in chapter 7, verses 6 through 12. So if you look at the names that are in chapter 7, verses 6 through 12, and you look at the names in chapter 8, these first 28 verses, for example, in this chapter, that you'll see names that are common or in common, but then you see a lot of names that are different. There seem to be two schools of thought about how this genealogies came to be like this. One is that the genealogies are tracing down different family lines, and therefore we would expect that the names are going to be different. Another theory that I don't necessarily agree with, but I'll throw it out there just for your consideration, is that this genealogy in chapter 7, the sons of Benjamin in verse 6, is actually a corrupted version of the genealogies of Dan and Zebulun. Like I said, I'm not sure, I don't believe I agree with that opinion, but I'll put that out just so that you know that theory, that opinion is out there. I do think that these two genealogies, the one in chapter 7 and the one in chapter 8, do describe different branches of the same family, and are going on that way, continuing on that way. If we notice, he goes down to verse 33 here with, again, the lineage here from Benjamin. Ner became the father of Kish, and Kish became the father of Saul. And so there's King Saul mentioned. Saul became the father of Jonathan, Malchi-Shua, Abinadab, and Ishmael, who we know as Ishbosheth. That's all. That's his. That's also his. Basically, his other name is Ishbosheth. And so we have those. We have these men identified and the sons of Saul. And we go down then through the lineage, really through Jonathan, because Jonathan's the son of Micah. Then we get the sons of Micah, and including a man named Ahaz. And then Ahaz becomes the father of Jehodiah. Jehodiah becomes the father of Elameth, and so forth all the way down. I found it interesting to look in verse 38. We look at verse 38. If we look down the lineage of this family from Jonathan, we see that Aziel had 6 sons, and they were their names: Azrikam, Bochur, Ishmael, Shariah, Obadiah, and Herod. And we see that name Obadiah. And you look back through the Old Testament, and of course, we remember the prophet Obadiah, who was companion of Elijah, and helped work with Elijah, and of course wrote the book of Obadiah. And but we don't know anything about the genealogy of Obadiah. We don't know we're not given his family's lineage. We're not given his father's name. We're not given really any information about Obadiah. He just simply sort of appears there in the book of I think 2 Kings, and becomes one of the characters of the book. But it would be interesting to think about: is this Obadiah mentioned here in this verse, in verse 38, the same Obadiah? I didn't count down the generations to see if perhaps this Obadiah that's mentioned here in verse 38 would line up with the lineage of the generations of the kings coming from Solomon, for example. That would have been interesting to see, and see if they perhaps could have been chronologically adjacent to one another. Didn't have the time or the frankly the willpower to do that. But if somebody wants to do that, take a look. But it is interesting to think about. Here is Saul, of course, who is noted even in this book for his failure to obey God, and yet somehow one of his descendants it could have been the same Obadiah, who was one of the leading prophets of the Old Testament, and a man of God. And so it just kind of shows that God is not constrained on who he can use or how he might be able to use folks for his will. That here is Saul, who refused to serve God as he should, and yet here this could be his great grandson who served him faithfully. So just an interesting question there, and probably needs some additional research. But like I said, when you look through both the account of Obadiah with Elijah, or you look at the book of Obadiah, we're never given Obadiah's family tree. Unfortunately, we don't know. A lot of times we'll know Obadiah, son of, or you get the who he's the son of anyway. Well, we don't have any of that information about Obadiah. All right, any comments about chapter 8? Yeah. Yeah, back in Judges, they were nearly wiped out. Yeah, but they recovered to the point that they become one of the leading tribes of Judah. Well, it joined with Judah. Judah and Benjamin became the anchor of that part of the nation. All right, so we go into chapter 9. Now we begin to see the importance of these genealogies. Now we begin to understand the importance of these genealogies. In verse 1, here's Ezra, again, I believe it's Ezra writing, who says, "Now, so all Israel was enrolled by genealogies, and behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel. And Judah was carried away in exile to Babylon for their unfaithfulness." I mean, that's just a very simple statement, but a very stark statement. They were carried away to Babylon for their unfaithfulness, says Ezra. And we might read the account of Jeremiah, and especially in Lamentations, to understand, what, I don't think we fully appreciate perhaps the ruin that came upon this nation with the destruction of their city, of their nation this way. I would have us, if we could take a moment and turn over to Lamentations 5 and have a look at some of the downfall that they suffered. If we look at Lamentations chapter 5. I'm just going to read this. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our reproach. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our houses to aliens. We have become orphans without a father. Our mothers are like widows. We have to pay for our drinking water. Our wood comes to us at a price. Our pursuers are at our neck. We are worn out, and there is no rest for us. We have submitted to Egypt and Assyria to get enough bread. Our fathers sinned and are no more. It is we who have borne their iniquities. Slaves rule over us. There is no one to deliver us from their hand. We get our bread at the risk of our lives because of the sword in the wilderness. Our skin has become as hot as an oven because of the burning heat of famine. They ravished the women in Zion, the virgins of the cities of Judah. Princes were hung by their hands. Elders were not respected. Young men working at the grinding mill, and youth stumbling under loads of wood. Elders are gone from the gate. Young men from their music. The joy of our hearts has ceased. Our dancing has been turned into mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. Because of this, our heart is faint. Because of these things, our eyes are dim. Because of Mount Zion, which lies desolate, foxes prowl on it. You, O Lord, rule forever. Your throne is from generation to generation. Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us so long? Restore us to you, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are exceedingly angry with us. And so if you kind of read through that account, read other parts of Lamentations, but you'll understand what had befallen this nation. This is a people whose capital city is ruined. Their capital city is deserted, is empty. They are essentially slaves in their own land. They are ruled over by others. They are having to live what we would call a hard scrabble life, kind of living hand to mouth. Their leadership is gone. Their leadership is utterly removed from them. And so we can understand then why Ezra has taken such care in these first 9 chapters of First Chronicles, because they're trying to restore this nation, and they're trying to get back to who is a Jew, who is a child of Israel. They've got to restore their nation. They've got to restore their religion, and they're not going to be able to do that without the information that they need to have on the families. And so here is Ezra, who's fulfilling that role. And yes, it seems a little tedious to us now, some removed from this, some 2,500 years or more. And yet we understand the importance that it had to this nation. The writer now in chapter 9 begins to chronicle those, or begins to list those who have returned from captivity. And so now we see the families that have returned from captivity. He says here, now the first, verse 2, the first who lived in their possessions in the cities were Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. Some of the sons of Judah, of the sons of Benjamin, and the sons of Ephraim and Manasseh lived in Jerusalem. And he begins to describe how these families begin to move back in and try to restore the city and restore the worship. We notice that it's the Levites are among the first ones back in, and of course, this is critical to them in reestablishing their religion. So, here come the Levites back in. And you can see the numbers from the sons of Zerah. There were, and Zerah, his relatives, 690, down in verse 9, and their relatives, this is the sons of Reuel, and their relatives, according to their generations, 956. And you see the comparison of these numbers to the list of warriors that were given back a couple of chapters earlier, and you realize just how far down this nation has been knocked, how far down they've fallen, when they can barely get 1,000 people out of a family to come back into the nation. Now, starting in verse 10, now he's going to list the priests. And of course, this would have been critical to the reestablishment of the religion. So here's the priests, and it's down and verse 14 of the Levites. And so here would have come both the priests and the folks that served at the temple. Levites who were not of the Aaronic line, they wouldn't have been priests, but they would have been servants of the temple. He begins to list those folks. They have to have the Levites. They have to have those folks serving in the temple. Beginning in verse 17, then he begins to list the gatekeepers. These would have been temple officers. This would have not been just simply, here's the doorman. No, this would have been an officer of the temple. This would have been part of the administration set up. And notice in verse 22 that he says that all those who were chosen to be gatekeepers at the thresholds were 212. These were enrolled by genealogies in their villages, whom David and Samuel the seer appointed in their office of trust. And so, he points out, this came from David and Samuel, both men who were appointed in that role by God, and therefore he's establishing the continuity of the services here, and the continuity of the authority of these men, officers set up by David and Samuel. In verse 28, he begins to list those who had various functions of administration in the temple. He even lists the men who are in charge of the bakery, which I find kind of interesting. This would have been more than just a servant type of role. This would have been a critical key part of their religion, and had to be done right. And so here's the men that are in charge of this. He goes then into verse 35, and here is again a recounting of the lineage of Saul. This is nearly an exact copy of what was in the previous chapter, in chapter 8, verses 29 to 38. Again, giving an account of the ancestors of Saul, and then of the descendants of Saul through Jonathan. Why does he repeat this list? He's just given it a few verses before. Why does he repeat this list? Well, he's about to go into the account of the defeat of Saul, and it is perhaps important to him to be able to show that this lineage of Saul didn't end, but the kingship of Saul ended. And so the fact that we've got yet still alive, perhaps among them, descendants of Saul, the kingship of Saul ended. And I think it was important to him to point that out. We go in then to chapter 10. Now, chapter 10 is where we begin to see the overlap with the other history books, or a greater overlap with the other history books. Chapter 10 is nearly identical to 1 Samuel 31. It is virtually a word-for-word account. We'll read it. This is the account of the death of Saul, fighting with the Philistines on Mount Gilboa. It says, now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines closely pursued Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle became heavy against Saul, and the archers overtook him, and he was wounded by his archers. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, otherwise these uncircumcised will come and abuse me. The armor bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took his sword and fell on him. And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he likewise fell on his sword and died. Thus Saul died with his 3 sons, and all those of his house died together. This is, again, I think it's intended to show the end of the kingship of Saul. We see how he describes how Saul, surrounded by the Philistines, wounded, he dies by his own hand. It also, if we read on, we'll find that it repeats the story again found in 1 Samuel 31 about the men from Jabesh Gilead who came and recovered the body of Saul from the Philistines and took it away and burned it. And so it gives essentially a complete recounting of that story from 1 Samuel. We do see, though, that Ezra does add a little bit of final commentary to this account that we don't find in 1 Samuel. And that is in verses 13 and 14. And if you will, you could suggest that we might suggest that this is sort of a commentary insertion from Ezra. Ezra points out, he says, so Saul died for his trespass, which he committed against the Lord, because of the word of the Lord, which he did not keep, and also because he asked counsel of a medium, making inquiry of it, and did not inquire of the Lord. Therefore he killed him and turned the kingdom to David, the son of Jesse. Ezra draws 2 conclusions from this account about Saul and about his death at the hand of Philistines. First of all, Saul. Why was Saul killed? Well, Saul was killed because 2 reasons. First of all, he failed to keep the word of the Lord. And of course, we remember that account where he was supposed to utterly destroy the Amalekites, and he did not. And the other thing was that he inquired of a medium, which he was forbidden to do. All the Israelites were forbidden to seek out a medium, and yet Saul had done that. And so why does Ezra insert this commentary into the text at this point? And we might suggest that Ezra does so. This is intended to be maybe an object lesson for the Jews. The Jews, of course, are very aware of the fact that their nation has been destroyed for much the same thing, for failing to keep the word of the Lord. That's what he says over in chapter 9 and verse 1. They were carried away into exile into Babylon for their unfaithfulness. Well, here is the example of Saul, who has the kingdom stripped from him. He is killed by the Philistines and loses the kingdom because of his unfaithfulness to the Lord. And we see here that Ezra's final comment is he turned the kingdom to David, the son of Jesse. This is his way of saying, look, here is the Here is the authority of David's kingdom. David had authority because he was given the kingdom from who? From God. God gave him the kingdom. God was the one who picked David, and now it's going forward with establishing his authority that way. Yeah, go ahead. Right. Yes. Right. That's right. Um, he had transgressed a number of times, failed to obey the word of the Lord, and God had told him, "You're not going to get to keep the kingdom." Well, I think at that time he was told, "Your kingdom isn't going to pass down to your descendants." I think he was going to let Saul stay as king, but he wasn't going to let him pass it down. And then it was later that he said, "I'm just going to take the kingdom away from him." I think it was with the Amalekites. From there, then, we got a few minutes left. We go into chapter 11. Any questions so far on anything? Any questions on anything? We go into chapter 11 then, and now we're going to see the focus on David and the establishment of the kingdom of David. Says we see here, all Israel gathered David to Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and your flesh. In times past, even when Saul was king, you were the one who led out and brought in Israel, and the Lord your God said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel, and you shall be a prince over my people Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel, according to the word of the Lord through Samuel. This whole part, we got the capture of Jerusalem, the capital city. Verse 4, then David and all Israel went to Jerusalem, that is Jebus, and the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, were there. The inhabitants of Jebus said to David, "You shall not enter here unless David captured the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David." Now David had said, "Whoever strikes down the Jebusites first shall be chief and commander." Joab, the son of Zeruiah, went up first, so he became chief. Then David dwelt in the stronghold, therefore it was called the city of David. He built the city all around, from the Milio even to the surrounding area, and Joab repaired the rest of the city. David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. This passage of chapter 11, 1 through 9, is nearly an exact copy of the text from 2 Samuel 5, 1 to 10, and kind of picks up the storyline in 2 Samuel. It recounts David's coronation as king over all of Israel, which was done in Hebron, and the capture of Jerusalem as his capital city. We do notice that Ezra omits information from the first 4 chapters of 2 Samuel. What was in the first 4 chapters of 2 Samuel? Well, it was the civil war that the nation had. The nation was split somewhat between David and his followers, and Ishbosheth and Abner and their followers. And we know that Abner and Ishbosheth had set up a stronghold, if you will, in a city that was on the east side of the Jordan River. There was, for a period of time, some civil war, effectively a civil war within Israel between these two. Abner, of course, is ultimately murdered by Joab, and Ishbosheth is ultimately murdered by a couple of his servants. And Ezra doesn't bring that up. He doesn't mention that. Why not? Well, it's not important to his storyline. His storyline here is the kingdom of David and the legitimacy of the kingdom of David, And going off onto a tangent of describing the Civil War is really kind of would really have been superficial to his ultimate goal, which is describing the kingdom of David here and what is done there. Um, um, if you remember the story of the capture of Jerusalem that's given over in 2 Samuel 5, the Jebusites had held that city. It was a natural stronghold. It was built on a set of hills, and it was within the area of the tribe of Benjamin. They had never been able to drive out the Jebusites. Even in the days of Joshua, they were unable to capture the city, and the Jebusites had become so confident that they could repel any invasion. They had begun to boast. They'd even told David, "Why, our lame and our blind will keep you out. You can't get into this city." And if you remember the story again there in 2 Samuel, Joab is able to lead a band of men, a band of fighters up a water conduit that goes into the city, and was able to attack them from within that way, and help to capture the city in that way. And so then the city fell, and it fell to David. All right, I'm going to stop there. We'll continue on with chapter 11 next week. I appreciate your attention this morning, and hope this was of value to you. Thank you.